We're going to start now.
I didn't have a glass.
So my name is Joanne Barlo, and I'm the moderator for this panel, and we're going to talk about memorable characters and how to make them. I write short stories. I'm working on a novel. I published a nonfiction book a long time ago, which I still brought. And I've been a writer for a long time, and I'm along with all of you wanting to know more about publishing. So I'm happy to present Natalie Sypolt, is that right? Sypolt. And Allie Marie, who are going to talk about memorable characters. So Allie Marie retired from a career in local and international law enforcement and began to write mysteries inspired by her colonial ancestors. Instead of the procedural crime mysteries she expected she might write. Her award-winning books combine the paranormal with historical fiction, a touch of mystery, and a sprinkle of romance. And I'm reading the first one in the True Colors series, and it's very good. Her first title in True Colors was published in 2015, and the fourth and last title was published this year. Oh, sorry, 15. In 2019. No, it's me. I just misread it. Two of her books were named finalists in the New England Reader's Choice Awards. Another was a double award winner in the IRC Awards. She travels the country for book signings, conferences, and local festivals. Be sure to pick up her books, and as with also Natalie's, at the bookshelf on the main lobby. Natalie Sypolt lives and writes in Preston County, West Virginia. She's a 2005 graduate of the MFA program at WVU and is currently assistant professor of English at Pierpont Community and Technical College. Her work has appeared or will appear in the Kenyon Review Online, Willow Springs, Glimmer Train, Appalachian Heritage, among other publications. She is the winner of Glimmer Train Youth Writers Award and the Betty A. Hart Prize and the West Virginia Fiction. She serves as an editor for the Anthology of Appalachian Writers, published by Shepherd University, and is the vice president of the Appalachian Studies Association. Her first book, The Sound of Holding Your Breath, a collection of very good short stories just finished, was published in 2018 by WVU Press. So I'm going to start out and ask you all to think about what do you think makes a memorable character? When you're writing, how do you envision your character? Where do you come up with your character? Does your character fit into the plot? Or does the plot come more from the character? These are the kind of things that we question. Also, how do we make our characters look and behave like real people? What distinguishes them from others that you may have read about? How do we make them three-dimensional, or even better, four-dimensional? How do we make them stand out, be vibrant, lively, and most of all, make you, the reader, care about them? These are the questions that we as writers work with every day. So I thought what we would do, we would talk about, I would ask a few questions about character, and then I hope that Allie Marie and Natalie will just take off where you want to take off, and then we're going to turn to you and ask you what your questions are or what comments you would like to make as you begin or continue to study character development in your own work. We want to hear the voices of the characters. We want them to be distinctive. We want to know what they look like. We want to understand the patterns of their behavior through the choices that they make and through what they say. Dialogue is a wonderful way to develop character. So the place of the story may be breathtaking, the plot may be exciting, but if the characters are flat or half-formed, the story won't hold its place in our hearts. So these are the questions I thought would be interesting for all of us. And I'm just going to maybe start with you, Allie, and then go to you, Natalie. So when you write, do you start with an idea for a character as you envision a novel? Or does character come to you from an idea of the story you want to tell?
I think it's come from both because I have a series. So the very first one was strictly what I call casting. You know, I don't know where the story's going to go, I'm just writing it. But the character was always in my mind because my historical part of the story comes from our American flag. Red, white, and blue. The white stands for the purity of our country and the ideals. The red is for courage and bravery, and the blue is for justice. So I wanted my characters to reflect that. So I had to write the Teardrops of the Innocent White Diamond story first, because I was starting out with the weaker ghost, the young child ghost, so she doesn't have the strength of the older ghosts, and that she embodies the innocence. And the main character, the modern character, is the more naive of the three main women characters. So I wanted that to flow all the way through, so I knew that the characters were going to embody that, whatever their color of the American flag was, which is why it's the True Color series, because the flashbacks seem to map to the American Revolution, but the modern characters have to find out what the mystery is, why these ghosts are appearing. So the first one is the child ghost, and she's always appearing with the teardrop on her face. And she says, "Find my teardrop," but she's actually looking for a white diamond necklace. So that plays into the mystery, and then the flashbacks tell you what happened to these old girls. Characters and plot are the two things I think that drive your stories. But you can have the best plot in the world, like Joanne just said, but if your characters are flat, nobody's going to get into the plot because they're not getting into the characters. And I like to think that I write characters, when you're reading that character's point of view, you become the character. In that sense, if you're seeing what that character is seeing, you're feeling what he or she is feeling, because I do have, my last two books are from the Colonial brother's point of view and his male descendant. So I had to think like a man for those. And but having been in police work and with brothers and everything like that, I know what y'all are thinking. But anyway, you want that to be so realistic, and the dialogue is where you make that character realistic when they are talking to someone. So when I have, whether it's a cop character, I don't want it to be the typical freeze that you see on TV. You want to know why they're getting to that. So I want the reader to be that. If they're at a dinner party, I want you to feel like you're sitting at one of those plates at a dinner party. And children, because the child, there's a kind of modern child that the ghost reaches out to make that contact, kind of a poltergeist type thing. I wanted that child to be everybody's little niece or nephew or child. When you see that 5-year-old kid and you know that is exactly what a kid would do or say. So I think that's kind of, I want you to be there with me, and I become my characters as I'm writing. So.
How about you, Natalie?
I think I don't need, do I need this microphone?
Oh,
Yes.
Yes, okay. Oh, for the tape. So for me, I think that I typically, and I'm not one of those writers who can tell you I do this exact same thing every time I write. I know some writers have that, and they can talk about their process. That I am not very good at talking about process or about following process, unfortunately. Typically, I don't have the character first. I have an idea for the story first, or I know there's something I want to try to address in the story, and then the characters will come as ways to address that. So, for instance, there was one summer when there were lots of tragedies in my area, and they were mostly murder-suicides. There were like maybe 4 murder-suicides in the course of the summer. And for a city, maybe that's not a lot, but for where I live, that's a lot, right? And what you kept hearing was, oh, this person is evil, this person is evil. And it's easy after an event like that happens to then paint that person as evil, right? But no one saw that the day before, or probably didn't see that the day before.
Yeah.
So the interesting thing to me was to explore that person's family, and that person's family who now has to figure out a way to grieve while also dealing with, their family member now being villainized, probably rightly so. But still, it's not necessarily part of the story that we get to see or talk about very often. So the idea was there, and then the characters came as service to that idea.
So you would say theme precedes character
For me,
in your
yes.
stories. And what about you, Allie?
Well, I kind of knew the theme was going to be a ghost story with colonial flashbacks and modern characters having to solve it. So that much was kind of from the theme. But the characters for this particular series, and I don't think it will always be like this, but they kind of have driven characters that I did not expect were going to be important. They were just important for one scene. In the middle of the night, just slap me and say, you're writing a whole book about me. And I'm like, okay. So these these characters will come to life to you and you don't expect it. And so you can't, I really, like I said, it's not so much character driven as what happens as you're driving it. And two characters of the new series will actually, it's a spin-off of the current series. It's, this little boy was in the camp. He's always supposed to be there because he does help the storyline for that scene. But he's a 10-year-old kid, he's an orphan in the camp, and he empties the captain's, chamber pot, shines his boots and things like that. Just what I needed for that story. He is actually the catalyst for the new series. Just because
Just
it just took a life of his own, and even though he only had that little bit part, and then the endings lead it into the next one, so you don't often know where these characters are going to take you, and you need to listen. They don't always talk loud now, they don't always talk out loud, but they're there.
So there's an unconscious part of
Yeah,
the character development where somebody speaks to you and then that character can suddenly
No.
take over.
Well, even in my book, there's somebody that's very, they find the skeleton for who the person turned out to be was not who my original plan was. And the storyline changed enough to say, and my husband's used to me doing this now, I've got it. What? I've just figured out how to do something, which is an exciting moment for an author that, where you think you're going or maybe you're stuck on something. That aha moment that's you didn't see coming means your readers don't see it coming, and you have a nice surprise for everybody. And so I hope that I can continue with that. I don't know.
If you want to pass that on, I'm going to start with Natalie this time. So we always read that characters have to develop through the plot or through the length of the story. So tell me how that happens in your stories, and do you think the characters have to change in what you're writing in order for them to be memorable?
Well, I think that that's part of the rule, right? Is that we're told that the protagonist has to show some change by the end of the story in order to be a dynamic character. And I think that in some regards that's true. There has to be some change in order for the story to be meaningful or even to deserve being told. Why tell the story if nothing changes, right? But I think there's also something to be said for a stagnant character who intentionally stays stagnant because that's part of their character, right? They're not a dynamic character in that they don't see change, but they're dynamic in their sameness, right? And you could probably think of a lot of people in your life who are like that, right? Who sort of never decide to change. They don't really develop, they don't really grow. And in that way, I think that, we need characters like that too if we're going to write realistic fiction, even nonfiction. I think that, we're talking about character development today, and we're mostly talking about fiction, but there also needs to be character development in creative nonfiction. I have a friend who is currently traveling the country. She was a librarian, she quit her job, sold her house, bought an RV, like one of those small RV vans, and is traveling the country. She's almost done with her year. And she's been writing little essays, and we share back and forth. And the characters in her essays, the people that she's meeting on her travels, are just as important as a character in a short story. And they have to, in some ways, be developed in just that same way, right? You still have to see them, you still have to understand who they are in order to make her change as the narrator.
Okay, so she changes.
Sure, right? I mean, hopefully she does. That's part of her goal, but right, to show her change as narrator, she has to show the people around her and her reaction to them. I think that that's the same way for our protagonists, right? You have to have characters to, reflect off of as they change.
So, you were going to
No. Well, I was just going to say, sometimes that arc works the other way too, and the strong character made by necessity of your story become the weaker link in it too. It just depends on its growth and, what's the opposite of growth? Shrinking or something, because it's not always, always having it ever after or whatever, and sometimes good characters weaken and weak characters become stronger.
Yes, you have a
Do
question?
you ever find that character you create takes over the story to the extent that the story you end up writing isn't the story you started out on, right? Because
I think everybody experiences that because it's just, and the strength of what you're writing comes from what that character is starting to go through or whatever. And my books just because of the editing changes, but it doesn't look like what I started because it's the same plot, the same theme, the same mystery, but some of the direction that it went came because of that character. If I do that, I don't have what I need to continue with. So you evolve with that.
And I've often heard writers, like successful writers at writing conferences say, if you know exactly where your story is going when you start, so does your reader. So it's not going to be terribly exciting or interesting for them. It's all going to be really predictable.
So, how does action shift character when you're writing?
Can you?
So if you have a plot idea, you think you have your characters, and then as you're working out the action, how does the character shift in response to the action, or don't they? Does it always go only the character develops and that changes the action, or can the action ever change the character?
I think for me, those things are always so intricately tied together that it's hard to say that this happened, so then the other happened. I think that the character's reaction, the way that the characters react to whatever the action that happens, is probably the most interesting or most important part of the story, right? Ron Rash once said that, y'all know Ron Rash, right? If you don't know the writer Ron Rash, you totally should. He's amazing. But he writes very dark stories. And he once said that somebody had questioned him and said, why are your stories always dark? Why are they always sad? And he said that the stories have to be a way so that when the character is put in a situation, you see them at their best and their worst selves. And if there's not something traumatic happening, then you're not able to see how the character would react to that, and therefore you're maybe not able to see that whole character. And I like that idea. That makes sense to me.
I do think, let me just say this because I'll keep forgetting mine, is that reaction, your character's reaction is important to the story, and is it realistic? So sometimes you have to pull from how would I react if I face this. My character in the first book actually experiences her first hurricane alone because her fiance is a firefighter and he can't live her during that. So I actually used some vignettes from different family stories because I had to get here late because of Dorian yesterday. So fortunately no damage or anything, but what you go through during a hurricane, if you haven't experienced it, is quite scary and it's prolonged. So what you do when you're sitting in your hallway, and I used what my sister had done, except I didn't, she had a glass of rum and a pack of cigarettes, and she had notes in case she needed to leave notes to any of us, but this was before we were texting and all. And so I used that fear of, did I do the right thing? This house could blow down around me, who's gonna help me, or whatever. So your character's reaction to whatever situation you're putting them in, I think is a key to that reality of, nobody would do that, or that's exactly what I would do. You know, flight or fight or whatever, make that realistic to the action and reaction. Okay. And I'm sorry, go ahead.
That actually is really perfectly my question, because I actually struggle a lot with that, because I find that sometimes I know how I would react, most times I don't know how I would react. And even if I do know how I would, I don't think it's necessarily how the characters that I'm creating will, because oftentimes they're not very much like me. So how do you find how characters, because I find that where it's something dramatic and then I just struggle, I don't know what someone would do in the situation. So how do you like get close to that moment or figure out what they would do?
I have a lot of kind of scenes like that where it hasn't happened to me, or, I mean, okay, who's got a ghost? Who confronts a ghost? You have to imagine what that character is going to do. They have a lot of ghosts, a lot of appearances and things, but I just lost my track of thought because I mentioned ghosts. But you study the people around you. If you know someone who's had a trauma, you don't want to impose on their trauma. But I'll give you an example. My brother had a very traumatic injury, and I needed to have an injury in one of the stories. I didn't know where to come from, but I drew from his injuries, even though I didn't experience them. But I was able to include what the characters felt when they were getting the bad news about the injured person, and kind of what the doctor said. I didn't have to get too clinical, just enough that, just like a doctor comes out and tells the family. So you can draw on your own experiences. And I find that this works the best when you draw on something that's happened or I recognized, and then work that into the story in that way. Just like a hurricane. I mean, I've experienced hurricanes, but to put somebody by themselves, where do I draw that from? And I think you can create or think how you feel if you went through that trauma. if you haven't been through, you kind of work that out. And dialogue can get you out of a lot.
Well, and I would say also don't feel like you have to make it something that somebody's already done, right? You can invent it. There's no right or wrong way that people respond to traumatic events. So do it however seems interesting and important to you. And nobody's going to really say, oh no, that person would not react that way when she's just murdered someone. Because people react different ways, right? And hopefully you're not writing from your own experience.
Yeah. I just wanted to add one thing. I think I find that when I'm writing dialogue, I see my character from the inside out and also the outside in. And so sometimes when you're reacting to something that you haven't lived through, it helps to see how your character is acting in that moment with other people. And then you'll find you draw on that person, that character, differently than if you're trying to give that exposition or description.
There's one question.
I have a question. What if you're writing about a character who's fundamentally different than yourself? Like if I, being female, is writing about a male of a different culture, for example. I'm trying to do as much research as I can about the culture, but I still don't have a real good grip on what it's like to be a man, for example.
Well, I'm going to let you talk about this most because I know that you've done some. And I've done some cross-gender narration too, and I think that there's two things to ask yourself. First is, why are you doing it that way? And is that necessary to the story? Because if you're just doing it because, or you're just doing it, as a gimmick or whatever, and I'm not saying that you are certainly, but, if that's the case, then don't do it, because it's going to turn out bad for everybody. But if there's a really good reason, then there's probably going to be human touchstones, right? Like, men and women are different, but there are emotionally some things that are the same. So figure out what the human touchstones are.
Actually, Natalie is just hitting on what I would suggest is that as humans, we are basically the same. So if you feel loved, if you feel happy, you feel sad, we may all feel it differently, but we feel it. So what you're capturing, if you have, whether it's a diverse person or opposite sex or whatever, are they going to feel the same way? So why can you not encapsulate what you feel into that character? Now, if you're going with a character unlike yourself, but you're trying to put yourself in those shoes, you've got to either know what they've gone through or have someone that can advise you for that. Because I'm writing about the American Revolution. How do I know what people felt like back in that time? And I have to kind of create that from what I feel are the human elements that we all have anyway, whether it's a good character or a not so good character, or even the evil characters. I like to think I'm not evil, but I found that I can pull some evil out. That it's like, I want people to hate this character, and they do hate that character. So it's okay to do that. I would be careful, like she said, is there a reason to do that? And does it fit the story to do that? I have diverse characters in the book because we are in a diverse world, and I think it's insane to just think that everybody in my book needs to be a white person. So I do have people of color as characters, and they're not the main characters because I'm not ready to write that part yet. But I like to have them presented in a positive way as a character just like anybody else in the book. Does that help?
It does. And getting back to what you were saying, Natalie, there's a good reason why I'm writing about these people who are different than myself. So I'm just trying to imagine and sort of intuitively experience what they might have gone through. I don't know what it's like to live or go through or serve in World War I, for example. But I'm doing the best I can based on the scrapbook I kept. So that's the touchstone that I have, and that's about the only one.
You can also read, first-person narrations about World War I from people who did live through it.
Right.
And then you get a flavor of the experience, but also a lot of the language, a lot of the, cultural moment of the time.
Okay. Yeah.
And also think about point of view and perspective, because it might be your natural inclination to start writing first person point of view. That's not necessarily the best or the only. You could always come at it in third person point of view, so you have some distance. Or maybe don't tell it from the perspective of the African American soldier, tell it from the perspective of his best friend, because that's maybe a place where you can relate more, you can see from the outside looking in. Right, this might be something to think about.
Yeah, thank you.
So I wanted to ask you guys, what's the hardest character you ever wrote? And then what's the character that you felt the closest to, that you felt the most empathy with?
I'm gonna let you answer that question.
I was buying my time. Probably Stephanie, it was my very first character. She was the protagonist of the first book.
Yeah.
And she has to deal with a lot to get to where she's going. And so she's kind of stuck in my mind as like my firstborn. You know, we all love our children, but that firstborn gets that little extra time with you that the other characters didn't. So she appears even in the sequel, because of her being involved in ancestry, and that line is going to continue. She will make cameo appearances, so people who loved her from the first book would say, there's Stephanie again. She won't take away from the story, but it just brings that familiarity of, oh, it's just like coming home and you see somebody that you remember from school, you chit-chat and you move on your way. My hardest, not hardest character to write, but the one I was hoping would be the most realistic, was my hero or protagonist in book 4 and 5, because the story continues with him. He has a biatch of a girlfriend. And I mean, I hated her from writing it, and I wanted everybody to hate her. But then as I got into the next book and I realized I hadn't really done what I wanted with the relationship, I was like, how am I going to have her get out of the story without killing her? And then I had that aha moment of, oh my gosh, I did not see this coming. Nobody saw this coming, and everybody just told me they didn't see it coming. And which is how she got her just rewards, because you don't want the bad guy necessarily to walk away and not have some repercussions for what they've done and tortured somebody, or I don't mean physically, well, yeah, that too, but I mean, she was just playing mind games, and everybody loves to hate her. So you want to be able to finish that. And I'm wrapping it in because
No,
okay. But anyway, she was the most because generally I'm not a biatch. I can be, but I'm not as a rule one. So I had to try to create every despicable person or little vignette that I have something and roll her into this character, because those moments whether it's the new clerk or the person who cut you off in traffic or whatever, you just want to like to have one moment with that person, and I roll them into one so that, like I said, I wanted everybody to love the character. And she does get her 2 cents. My 2 cents.
I just want to say that I love that you're killing people in your books. But you
these are not the murder mysteries.
Oh, okay.
Those all happened back in the old days, but yeah,
Oh, okay.
be honest, is coming.
So I think it's a little bit different for me because I have primarily written short stories, and oh my gosh, he lost his
Yes,
leg.
it did. It gives an arm and a leg for this crap.
And the book that I have, my published book is a collection of short stories, and the characters are not linked. The book that I'm looking for a publisher for now, those stories are linked, so they're recurring characters, and I'm writing a novel. So I think it's different when you're working with characters in just a really short, condensed time, and Joanne can probably speak to this as well, that maybe don't necessarily feel the same kind of connection. In this collection I have a lot of people that are like people in my family, people that I grew up around. It's really important to me to represent my place, to represent it and to represent it as accurately as I can. Which does not mean to idealize it or to make it this gleaming West Virginia city on a hill, because it's certainly not, but also not to stereotype it or to try to see it as realistic as I can. So I think the characters that are very much like the people that I love, warts and all, are the ones that I feel closest to. And my stories, a lot of them are kind of dark. I sat down and I've got curly blonde hair, and I'm wearing my writing instrument dress, and my book is hot pink, and Joanne said to me, your stories are good, but kind of dark. So sometimes it's hard to write those characters because you know, I'm not necessarily a dark person, but my stories come out that way a lot. And I think it's that same reason that I talked about before, that the way that you really see how characters, who they are, and can say something is by putting them in situations where they have to react.
Does place affect how you see them in your stories?
In my writing, place affects everything.
So place is a very important part.
Absolutely,
of
yeah.
everything you're writing.
Yeah, being an Appalachian writer to me is a very important part of my identity. And I think that we have some great, beautiful, wonderful writers who are not necessarily represented in at the national scale because they've been sort of pigeonholed as regional writers. But they're writing about things that, you know, are universal, right? Who is it that said that if you want to know what's going on in the world, look at Appalachia because we're a microcosm of things that are happening everywhere. So I got way off topic.
No, that was great.
This is exactly what happens to writers, because as an idea forms and then it leads you somewhere else, and the place is important to the story. Like I said, I had to change mine. I'm loosely basing the colonial characters on ancestors I actually found in my family tree, but it's not their true story, because I didn't want to do a bio. Who wants to know about these characters? And I didn't want to do a true historical, but I could create their flavor from what I've learned about them and sneak little tidbits about where I actually use, like, the priest's name when he comes to do the baptisms is actually the priest that was in the records that the traveling priest up in New England. I didn't want to put my story in New England because of the research. I'm like, okay, well, we already know about Boston and the Revolution. If I place it down there, I capture a different part of the Revolution. And I've said this in the other class, Cornwallis was actually headquartered in Portsmouth, where the story is based. And he decided to move to Yorktown, which if he had stayed in Portsmouth, we would probably be under the British Crown because he would have been able to probably win the war. But by moving to Yorktown, and I found this out through research, not because I remembered Sister Edith's class, but the Americans were able to take over on the land side, basically in the short nutshell, and the French captured the waters, and it really protected everybody. I mean, they were lost and they couldn't get out, couldn't get supplies. And so they had to surrender. So those places needed to be, captured in this story. And it does change the flavor because you can create a little something from the place and the character can adapt to it, refer to it. Just one little mention so that you don't become a historical writer, but when a character says this is where Cornwallis surrendered to Washington, which he didn't actually, he played hooky that day and sent it second, but that's a whole other history lesson. But these little things are
about place.
Yes, exactly.
So we've talked a little bit, I'll just take so much so they can hear me. We've talked so far about how action affects character or how character affects action. Now we're talking about how place affects character, or how your characters develop with a certain place, and so they have a certain flavor that comes from that place. So now I'd like to ask you about tone. How does the author's tone affect character, or how the character is perceived?
She does not give me that second to formulate my question.
That's because I want it.
Because I want a moment.
I think, I don't know that I concentrate so much on my tone because I think I developed a flow where I can adapt. As I'm writing, I'm not thinking about it. If I need to be a little dark, I'm able to go a little darker, make it a little sadder for that moment and bring it back up in something happy. So I think, I've really never thought about it, and it's something I will think about it, but I do think I can keep the tone appropriate for the scene that I want to do. If I want you to cry, hopefully you will. If I want you to laugh, I want that out loud chuckle, and I base this on watching people when my husband was the first guinea pig for my story, and I literally stood around the corner biting my nails because I didn't know what to expect. And he doesn't care to read that much, and I would see him and okay, good, there's something funny, and I hope I laughed at the right tone. And then the kind of like, you see the little, oh, that's too bad. Okay, there's a sad moment, this is good. And then when he told me, in the one, especially the one scene that he read, he said, that brought a tear to my eye. And I'm like, oh, yes, because that's what I hoped. I don't want everybody to boo-hoo and have to get a box of Kleenex, but I want you to feel that emotion, but I want to bring you out of it as soon as I can too. Because for my particular books, it's not to be dark all the way through. Did that give you time, Missy?
I think that,
Tone affects your character.
yeah, except I don't think about that directly.
I know you don't.
Yeah, so I think that, and maybe this is different for every writer, and this is something that y'all can speak to as well, but I like things to feel organic, and for me, I want them to happen organically, because I think that when you read the story, it feels organic. As a reader, I do not like to feel manipulated. I do not like to see the writer back there like turning the screws or whatever. That annoys me. So I feel like if I were to go in and immediately think, I will now do this because I want, you know what I mean? I don't think that I think about tone a lot in that way. I don't think a lot of writers do. Really. Maybe afterwards they say they do so that they can talk about it. It sounds really smart, like, oh yes, I meant that exactly. But I don't know that that's necessarily the case. I do think it's funny when I thought something was very serious, and it was like a really serious moment in my story, and I'll read that story and everybody will laugh. And I'm like, oh, I have a story that I think Caitlin's probably heard me read, that my friends kindly refer to as the Bloody Knuckle Salad story, because the protagonist in the story is grating carrots and gets her knuckles on the grater, and then feeds that salad to her husband, who's a vegetarian. See? Well, see? Right? I never meant it to be funny, but people seem to think it is. I think it's uncomfortably funny. Right? So yeah, I don't really think about tone.
Consciously.
At least consciously. And first draft. I might go back later in revision and think, okay, so I need to adjust this or turn this up or something like that.
I just have one more question, and then we'll open it up to anything you guys want to talk about. And that is, the general rule in writing is that the protagonist must be likable and sympathetic almost from the start of the story. How do you create complexity in the main character when you know you must keep him or her sympathetic?
Am I going to pass it? I'm going to take it and myself. And my answer is I don't think the protagonist has to be likable or sympathetic.
Right.
I think that it helps if they're at least sympathetic so that you can, relate to them and want to follow them. I don't think it's necessary. I do think complexity is necessary. Certainly complexity is necessary. I was watching Grease last night, and I was just too lazy to turn the channel. And it was, on some channel they're airing Grease all the time. And Dirty Dancing, Grease and Dirty Dancing. So I was watching Grease, and it was a mistake, because I haven't watched it for a long time, and I used to really love that movie, and I was watching it, and I'm thinking, I don't even know if this is very good anymore. And the characters you're supposed to like, y'all know Grease, right? The characters you're supposed to like and follow, the protagonists are Sandy and Danny, right? And I'm thinking, I don't think I like Sandy very much. She's not very nice. She was mean to poor Lorenzo Walnut. All he wanted to do was date her, and she was so mean to him. And the only one I really kind of like is Rizzo, right? So Rizzo's the only interesting one, and I say this to my friend who I'm like texting with, and she says, well, it's the classic virgin and whore diagram, right? Like, they're everywhere. Those characters are everywhere. And I don't know where I'm going with this other than talk about Grease. But you see what I mean, right? The interesting character, sure, you can change your mind, and the interesting character is not always the one you're supposed to like. It's not always the one who does the right things. It's sometimes the one that's more complex.
I think that's true too, and I don't know that I necessarily write the character to be likable. I mean, if you're going to be the star of the book, and it's a lighthearted, mine is a light paranormal, certainly I want them to be likable, but that's not the intent.
Creating sympathetic. Maybe I shouldn't have used the word.
Well, no, likable is also an accurate word. Stephanie is likable. In the second book, the main character has a harder time and is more cranky and almost dislikable because, okay, come on, let's give the guy a chance, do this or do that, So I think it just has to be, as you're creating the stories, you just go with the flow, and you want your characters to either grow or, and again, it goes back to what we talked about earlier, maybe your most likable character is going to deteriorate into the depths of evil doings, or the bad guy finally sees the light or whatever, and maybe becomes a more likable character. So I think it goes either way, and I just think write what you feel and adapt it as you go along.
I think that Sookie Stackhouse is a good example. You guys read the books of the True Blood shows? No. But she's a good example because she does not change really. She's that same perky, put my ponytail on top of my head character through that whole 12-book series. At the beginning you like her, she's very likable. At the end you want to smack her in the head, right? She's on your nerves by then, and you're like, why do you keep making the same dumb decisions? Change.
So you're longing for change.
Yes, yeah, in some ways. But I wanted to answer maybe the second part of your question, which I did not answer before, which was how do you
create complexity in the main character when you're working to keep him or her on some level sympathetic?
And I would say that again, as I talked to this lady about earlier, I think that play with point of view and perspective, that can be a really interesting way to address complexity or address a character who's not likable, but to make them sympathetic to the reader. If you've not ever tried writing in second person point of view, for example, that could be a really interesting experiment to try. Not everybody likes second person. That's you, right? Where you write it from the you perspective. Not everybody likes it. Some journals say, don't send me a story in second person, I will never publish it. But if you do it well, it can be really, really effective. Bright Lights, Big City by Jay McInerney is a good example. That protagonist is not terribly likable, and he's not terribly sympathetic. He's a brat, he's a drug user, makes all kinds of bad decisions. But because that story is written in second person point of view, you read it as yourself, right? It forces you as the reader to put yourself in his shoes. And even though you might not like him, you can start to see more things from his perspective, which makes it kind of more readable.
Can you elaborate on the difference between second and third?
Sure, so second person point of view uses the pronoun you, and third person point of view would use the pronouns he, she, or it. So, I wish I had one. And first person's I, right? So second person would be like, you walk into the room, the first thing that you notice is a dead body laying in the middle of the floor. So the you is a character, but it's also written in a way that it's putting the reader in the shoes of that. I can give you some good examples. So Bright Lights, Big City is a good second person. That's one of the only novels that I can think of.
It's hard to sustain.
It's hard to sustain.
What it almost sounds like in a colloquial way of speaking. I've got friends in New York that are more apt to say, so you go down here, and that's what I feel like, and that's how they talk. So it almost comes off as a stylistic kind of, I get that it's a, you're telling me.
Right.
I'm not sure, but it's done that kind of good story. It might have been like, oh, this guy talks with somebody, he's got a great soul.
Yeah.
Walk in, you go in.
Right, yeah, I think that it's part of the sustained narrative. If that just happens like in a piece of it, then you'd say it's maybe colloquial dialogue. But if it's sustained through a course of the novel, and maybe I'm not doing a great job explaining because
There's different approaches for
right.
it.
And it's different than it's different than epistolary. Epistolary is what you would get if you're writing a letter, right? Like, dear Brian, I really miss you. I haven't seen you in ages. That you is not the second person because there's still an I behind it. Second person is more like an instruction manual. You do this. You go here. You feel this way. And part of the trick, this could be a whole meal on this.
There's a lot of detachment
Yeah.
and the ability to disconnect yourself. If you're using it, you're not focused.
And I'm really fascinated by second person point of view and the different things it can do. I think a lot of times writers will use second person when the writer isn't somebody that's necessarily likable on the surface. I have my students read an essay in second person called Cliche Rape Story, and it's written by a young woman who was date raped. So the whole story is written in second person. It's you went to this party, you got into the car, and I like talking to them about how she uses that to distance herself from her traumatic events. Okay? Lori Moore, the writer Lori Moore, does a lot with second person. And hers is often really funny too, which is cool. She has a story called How to Be the Other Woman, I think is the name of the story. And it starts, your cat is a whore, accept it. And it's,
Well, it also says it might make the reader feel more complicit in what's happening.
I don't want to get too much into person. Because
I know, that was
wanna
my
go back
fault.
to
I
character,
did.
that's okay. And I want to see what any of you want to say or ask about character, yes.
Yeah, well, when I started writing 20 years ago, nothing's kind of again. One thing I learned was that, or it was suggested to me by Thomas, not unlike this, I think about Philadelphia, was to map your character, you should make kind of a character profile outline. Okay, color, eyes, little hair, background, how old, blah, 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 you know. And then when you fill this in, each of your character has a different eye color, so you then start imagining this character, this person in your mind, and then you actually print your story into it. So I did that when I wrote my novella, and it helped me kind of sort out who was talking to whom when I started getting into it. But do you guys do anything like that, or is that like an old school thing?
I keep saying that I'm going to complete a police file on every one of my characters because they have changed hair color or eye color. In the beginning, you start out with blue eyes and then mysteriously turn brown. Or I can't remember the birth dates. I haven't done it yet. I actually have a blank to fill in with just like that, the age, the birthday, because sometimes that's referred to in the book. The hair color, something significant like where they were, what they like, what they dislike, just enough to get that character, because if that's showing up in their personality, and especially a complex person, you know, hates kids, hates bees, loves roses, you want that complexity to be the same all the way through or have a reason for it. So it's not a bad idea to do that, and I've heard that people will go online to like Pinterest or whatever until they find a character that looks like who they think. I have a firefighter because the hero of the first book is the hero. He is a firefighter. And there's all kinds of firefighters, you know, from the beefcake calendar guys who look great and they're fine, but is he who I want? And then there's just one guy who's obviously after the end of the fire, sitting there in his fire coat and a little smudge of, it's a black and white photo, and I said, there's Gage. So at least in my mind, so if you want that, there's nothing wrong with that. You have that little picture of a character or a person that you said, boy, there's Aunt Biddy. She's perfect. This lady is perfect for my character, Aunt Biddy. So you can always refer back to her and say, okay, yeah, she's got the little skinny, scrawny crow's neck, and when she smiles, the wrinkles show up, because you want the character, your readers, to see that character too. So I think that is the perfect thing to do, if you can stick with it, which I don't.
I was the only danger of that for me, and I'm absolutely not saying that you guys are doing this, but I tend to do that so I don't have to write. Like instead of spending 2 hours like, oh, my Pinterest board, oh, the bad life. And so for me, it's much more useful to like create a situation and see what that character decides. I think it's more interesting for me than spending a lot of time like trying to figure out exactly how they look, because I know that for me it's a distraction, so I don't have to do the hard work.
writers are experts.
Absolutely, and I've heard people say that the problem is, especially with me with the series, and because all of these characters make appearances once their book is finished, but they're still important to end the series, I have to remember something about them from the first, and I found out you don't remember it. I have to go back and I pull things out of each of the books because I would not have remembered it without going back. And if you have the file, which if you especially if you're kind of in the writing stage, go ahead and do it because you have that. You don't have to be complete. It doesn't have to be every arrest record, every mole, or every tattoo, unless it's going to be integral to the story. But they think that you need to be the same, and especially in a series. If you're only doing a standalone one time, how important does every detail have to be? But for a series, yes.
What tips or recommendations do you have to creating your character or realistic character in a different historical time period?
Well, that's where the research comes in, and like you talk about, I get bogged down with the research because I'm trying to be accurate, and just to look up in colonial, the clothing that the women wear, nothing like what they actually went commando, if you want to know the truth. I did not know that at the time, but a lot of colonial women went commando, and but they had pinafores, and then they had these pocket things that the skirts went over. I would have had my character reaching into her pocket to draw out the diary, but by researching and finding out what, and I don't remember what the name was, because once I'm done, it's like my test, I'm done studying for it. So I don't remember what it was called, but there was actually a specific item of clothing that the colonial women wore to carry their valuables or whatever they needed with them. And not a purse, but something that they wore on them. So in order, that research can bog you down, but it's so necessary because one mistake, and somebody who's especially a historian of that time, they will nail you on, women didn't wear that in those days, or the men didn't wear that, or they didn't, that was not invented till later on. I had to research when hypodermic needles were invented for one of the books because this was in the 1860s, and I don't remember now. Anyway, the hypodermic needle was able to be used in that scene. And if it wasn't, I would have to take it out and come up with some other way to take care of the person in the scene.
Just maybe reading.
I Googled everything. I mean, were hypodermic needles invented in 1863? And then you get the little Wikipedia blurb or something that will say they were invented in 1901. Oops, and I don't know, I'm just throwing out the dates, but I just find that those little blurbs, when I was trying to figure out things for Portsmouth, the research, what significant events happened in Portsmouth Revolution in 1781, that's how I found out Cornwallis was there. I mean, I would have found it out with reading reams and reams of paper, but I wanted that quick answer to be able to say Cornwallis was here in July of 1781. That's all I needed to know, so I didn't need to read the whole history of it. So these little things, just Google the thought first, find out what it leads you to, and there'll be 100 other ways to get you off topic, but you can at least capture that one sentence. Maybe that's all you need in your whole book is to refer to that one thing historically, but be accurate.
Thank you.
I don't have anything, my characters are not historical, other than like last year.
Anybody have any other questions you want to ask about character? Yes.
How do you avoid making caricatures?
Well, it's not always bad to have a caricature. I have a cranky old lady that pops up. She's just a dear old great aunt of the family, but she's cranky. She wears these snarky t-shirts that say, I can't remember what at the moment, yeah, this is my face, get used to it, or whatever. I can't remember all the ones. Some of them I come up with on my own, and some I've seen on t-shirts, and I just copy them over. So she's really a caricature. She wears lime green Crocs, and her hair is spiked, but everybody, she's endeared to her because we all have quirky customers, so characters. You don't want every character in your book to be over the top or too large for life. He's a caricature because it came about his accident. I needed a skeleton. He didn't have the clothes on. He was tired of being naked, and I had to fix him. But I wanted the skeleton display on with my Halloween. And for Halloween, I go all out because my books do have ghosts and skeletons. So I had bones, and because I was bored on a long trip, I started making him do things. And now he's got his own little following on my page. Everybody wants to know when Bones is going to do something. I mean, it was just silly stuff out of boredom, but I will eventually make a little children's story about the misadventures of Sherlock Holmes. That's his name. He decided that when he wanted clothes, he tells me what to do, and I make him a little outfit. And he's been around the world with me, so he made his appearance. This is his first appearance in almost heaven. But I'll play that up for a couple of slides on the thing because people will relate that to me, the books, and the character. So when you create a character, maybe you'll find that you want it to be a caricature, or you don't, but if you do, you play on that person to say, oh, here's a perfect example of Aunt Biddy who's in my book such and such. And everybody gets that same picture or whatever, but you just relate for life. Who is around you, we're all normal, so to speak, but that's where you draw from, your life experiences, your personal experiences.
Your powers of observation.
Absolutely, and then you just color the characters you want to be quirky. You got Hannah in my book, she's a caricature of about 3 different cranky ladies that are lovable, so she's got little personas that I know are in there. And sometimes people will ask you, is this character me or so-and-so? It's a good character, and I might say yes. If it's a quirky one, maybe not. But they're fun to write, so don't discount them, but it depends on your genre and what you write. I babbled and I'm sorry.
And I was going to say, it really depends on what kind of writing you're doing. as a West Virginia writer, as an Appalachian writer who writes stories set in West Virginia, if I had anything in there that bordered on caricature or stereotype that I didn't, intentionally do for a reason, it would be really bad news, right? Not just for me, because I would hate it, but the Appalachian community will come after you, and rightly so, right? We've faced a lot of ugly stuff because of that. But at the same time, you can't not have character live in a trailer because you're afraid that somebody's going to say, oh, there's that West Virginian living in a trailer. Because people live in trailers, you have to be true to the character. It's a tight rope you walk. And I mean, it's different depending on what genre you're into or whatever, but if you're trying to write realistic fiction, you have to be really careful about stereotypes and caricatures.
One of my pet peeves, having been a law enforcement officer and retired, and I work with officers overseas, so I've had a very good experience with all types of law enforcement officers. And I actually do a class that I call Dirty Weapon Lethal Harry. And now Lethal Harry is involved in there because I try to come up with the stereotypes that people have of police is don't continue with those. Thank you, perpetuate them because some of them are missed. Okay, Dirty Harry has been done. So can you not come up with a new, even if you want him to be, a wild cop or whatever, does he have to be a caricature of Dirty Harry? Come up with your own. And so I have a whole thing on the things that help me because when I'm reading a police procedural, if the young, pimply-faced rookie cop with buck teeth is there, I know he's going to screw up this crime scene. He's going to let the bad guy get away, or he's the one that's taking the bribes. Why can't the good-looking guy be the one that totally shocks everybody and didn't see it coming? So I do have a pet peeve about that. So sorry.
No,
But if you want to, at Hampton Roads Writers, in 2 weeks, there's going to be one in Virginia Beach, and it's the Hampton Roads Writers that actually have a very similar course to what you're getting here, and I'm doing a presentation on that for the whole hour.
So I'm sorry, sensitive to the time. I hope you enjoyed this conversation on character. If you have any one last question, ask it quickly, and then we're going to release ourselves to get ready for the next meeting. Thank you.
I will just add real quickly that there are often real-life consequences to stereotypes, to perpetuating the stereotypes, especially when it comes to, groups of class and race and gender. So you have to be sensitive to that for reasons other than just bad writing.
So can we thank, please, our panel?